Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Preparing a Successful Bid for State Capital Budget Dollars, a webinar presented by Heritage Ohio, the Greater Ohio Policy Center, and the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. My name is Devin Miles with Heritage Ohio. It says Matt Weirhold, but this is Devin Miles, and I am excited to host this webinar presentation where you have an opportunity to learn more about the upcoming state capital budget and how your organization or community can access those capital dollars. Before we get going, I just wanted to give you a couple quick things about today's webinar. First, we're thankful that these webinars are presented in part by funding from the Ohio Department of Development and the Ohio Arts Council. And finally, if you have any issues today with your webinar, just close out the webinar, re-sign in. Same thing goes with the phone. Typically, that solves most of your problems. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. We're going to be answering questions once the presentation is formally over. So in about 45 minutes, we'll start answering those questions for you. So before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to tell you a bit about Heritage Ohio. Heritage Ohio is Ohio's official historic preservation and Main Street organization. Heritage Ohio fosters economic development and sustainability through preservation of historic buildings, revitalization of downtowns and neighborhood commercial districts, and the promotion of cultural tourism. So typically we host these webinars, as I said, every single month earlier. You can find these webinars on our website. You can sign up for our email list to get notifications of those, and you can find them on our YouTube channel as well. So today's webinar will be presented by Jason Warner, the Director of Strategic Engagement at the Greater Ohio Policy Center, Ohio's leading nonpartisan nonprofit organization devoted to the promotion of sustainable growth in Ohio's cities and metro areas, and also Jessica DeLong, Grants Administrator for the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, which oversees capital projects undertaken by state agencies and state-supported institutions of higher education, and they manage Ohio's school facilities program and administers funding for community-based cultural and sports facility projects. Our first presenter will be Jason Warner. Jason, as I just mentioned, is the Director of Strategic Engagement at the Greater Ohio Policy Center. Jason brings over 20 years of experience working in and around Ohio state government to representing Greater Ohio Policy Center at the Ohio Statehouse, advocating for issues and policies, positions on central to the organization's mission, as well as overseeing the organization's strategic communications operation. Jason is a 2001 graduate of the University of Akron, where he received a Bachelor's of Arts degree with a concentration in American political science. He also holds a certificate in applied politics from the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. As a member of the Ohio Lobbying Association since 2016, Jason is a certified lobbyist, possessing in-depth knowledge of the legislative, executive, and regulatory procedures, along with the rules, regulations, and ethical standards to which all lobbyists in Ohio must adhere. Welcome, Jason.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. As Devin said, my name is Jason Warner, and I am the Director of Strategic Engagement at the Greater Ohio Policy Center. My presentation today is going to be focused on the capital budget process, and more importantly, what your community can be doing now to help secure funding for projects in the 2024 budget. The capital budget is very different from the main operating budget, which was just approved by lawmakers in late June. The capital budget is focused on just that, capital projects that prepare, reconstruct, and construct capital assets, which belong to state agencies, colleges, universities, and public schools. ODOT, which has a separate budget that covers capital projects, is not included in the capital budget. Typically, the capital budget is approved in the second year of biennium, and over the years, it has become a source of funds for local communities or regions of the state to fund capital projects. Most capital budget projects are supported by long-term debt issued by the state in the form of bonds. However, the state can also dedicate other revenues at its disposal for capital projects. In the 2022 capital budget, over $692 million, or close to 20% of the capital budget, was funded through cash reserves. This includes specific programs like the State Fire Marshal Fund or the Wildlife Fund, but also includes one-time monies like the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which earmarked over $400 million in project funds that year. So now that we know where the money comes from, what type of projects can your community apply for to support? Community projects that receive state funds must support the acquisition, construction, improvement, and related equipping for projects that demonstrate a clear state benefit. This falls under 5 basic categories. Higher education, if your community has a college or university, community college, or any other affiliated institution of higher learning. Mental health or general public health related programs, including a community-operated medical center or not-for-profit institution. Parks and recreation. This is something of a catch-all type of category and is one of the most supported areas for community projects, ranging from recreation centers and parks to the ever-popular splash pads. The 2022 capital budget, for instance, included funding for 11 different splash pads across the state. Conservation. This is a category that includes the GREEN program that was created through the Clean Ohio Conservation Fund back in 2002 and supports farmland preservation and development of parks and other green spaces throughout the state. And finally, cultural and sports facilities, another catch-all program that has been used over the years to support projects across the state, including the preservation of local cultural assets such as old movie palaces, vaudeville theaters, stadiums, museums, and the constructions of venues such as amphitheaters. So as I previously mentioned, the enactment of the capital budget is very unlike the enactment of the state's main operating budget. That process took nearly 6 months to complete, had scores of opponents, and needed a conference committee to resolve significant differences between the House and Senate versions of the budget. After all that was said and done, the governor approved the budget, which missed its constitutional deadline by a few days, but not before issuing a series of line item vetoes. By contrast, the capital budget is usually introduced, passed, and improved within a matter of weeks, if not days, and generally without any opposition. As they say, everyone gets a bite at the apple and everyone benefits from what's included in the budget. The capital budget occurs within the context of the preparation of the state's 6-year capital improvement plan, which is updated every 2 years by OBM upon the recommendations of state agencies. Now what do you, as a potential community project beneficiary, need to do to access these dollars? Well, first you need to identify what projects in your community or region will benefit from capital budget funds. Is there a catalytic project in the downtown area that you have been working on for years that needs that extra kick from the state to get the project over the finish line? Is there a new recreation facility that the community is interested in? Maybe members of the community have been calling for new pickleball courts. These are all projects that could potentially benefit from capital budget support. The next question is, who will be the project sponsor? In most cases, this is a public entity, the Parks Department or community hospital, for example. Project sponsors can be private entities as well. For example, a local nonprofit organization which purchased the old movie theater and is looking for support for the restoration and renovation of the venue. These entities are eligible to be project sponsors as long as they are in good standing with the state. Project funds may only support capitalization costs incurred from the construction or purchase of long-term fixed assets to produce long-term state and economic benefits. You cannot, for example, use funds to cover salaries or benefits for staff. These are operational funds. While not required as part of an initial request, it is always good to be able to show that there is local support, including local financial support for a project, as it demonstrates community involvement, investment, and support in the project. Now that you have the project or projects identified, the next step is to formally request project funding from the state. In the capital budget, this is done by working with your state representative or state senator. You don't have to include them both, but it does not hurt to do so. If requests are submitted in both chambers, it will only help to increase the chances of your project being funded. The more information about the project that you can share with lawmakers, the better. It is very likely that they may be asked to provide extra details about the scope of the project as part of the review process. And if you can say, for example, that this request will cover the final 10% of the overall project and will go towards X, Y, and Z, then you are going to be well positioned to secure funds. It certainly does not hurt to invite lawmakers to see the project site firsthand so they can better understand the project. Many lawmakers' districts cover multiple counties and include scores of cities, villages, or townships that may not often get a chance to visit. These visits help them better understand the request and help you underscore the importance of the state investment in the project and the community at large. The next step is outside of your control, but if you have successfully completed steps 1 and 2, it should work in your favor. This is when lawmakers submit their requests to the finance chairman of their respective chambers. Both offices collect all of the requests, and then leadership, with the support of their budget staff, review the requests and finalize recommendations, developing the capital budget plan. All of this is done behind the scenes, and it is only when the capital budget is officially introduced that you know if your project was included. Once this happens, blink an eye and you may miss the entire legislative process. As we have previously mentioned, the capital budget can pass in a matter of weeks and is rarely, if at all, received any no votes. If your project was funded in the budget, then congratulations, you have moved on to step 4. The budget is sent to the governor, who will sign the bill, and then it becomes effective in 90 days. Now, don't expect your check to arrive in the mail on the 91st day. There are a few more steps that need to be completed. Project sponsors who did receive a specific allocation in the budget will need to work with the state appropriating agency to ensure that the project meets all of the requirements, and legal agreements will need to be executed. Once those agreements are executed, the information is sent to the Office of Budget and Management for review prior to being submitted to the State Controlling Board or agency director for approval. Once approved, the project sponsor can submit payment requests to the state agency for reimbursement of expenses covered by the approved funds. Jessica will be able to provide more information about this process in her presentation momentarily. So to wrap up, I want to share a few examples of projects that received funding in the most recent capital budget to give you specific examples of the type of projects that may qualify. First is the Freedom Landing Dock located in Village of Ripley in Brown County, located along the Ohio River. The village received $400,000 through the Ohio Department of Natural Resources for the Freedom Landing Riverfront development. The Freedom Landing Dock puts the dock below Front Street with an access road to the dock. This location was chosen to avoid creating a barrier or obstructing views of the river and will serve as both a recreation and commercial dock for large riverboats such as the Delta Queen. Next is the Eric Mendelsohn Park Synagogue Campus Restoration Project, located in Cleveland Heights in Cuyahoga County, which received Sustainable Community Associates received a $1 million grant through the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission so that they can renovate the former synagogue, school, and 28-acre campus as a space for parks, community development, arts, housing, and economic development. The project is benefiting from both public and private funding, and state funds are intended to address structural integrity, waterproofing, HVAC, electrical, and plumbing maintenance. Finally is the Hotel MacArthur in Vinton County's Village of MacArthur. The Vinton County Commissioner and Visitors Bureau received $100,000 through the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. The hotel, built in 1839, is the oldest building still in use in Vinton County, predating even the county's formation in 1850. The hotel is being renovated for the use as a hotel, restaurant, and visitor center. The hotel would be the only one operational in the county, and grant funds will be used for the restoration of the lobby area. So that wraps up my presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention. I believe that we are going to hold all questions for the end of the presentation today, but before I turn things back over to Devin, I wanted to share my contact information. These are the best ways to reach out to me should you have any specific questions about the legislative process around the capital budget. And you can see our social media information as well, so you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where we will be sharing more information about the capital budget process as it becomes available. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jason. Now I'd like to introduce our second presenter of the afternoon. Jessica DeLong is the Grants Administrator for the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission and has a bachelor's degree from the Ohio State University and has served as the state Ohio representative for the last 13 years. Jessica will speak about what happens after the organization is successful in obtaining a capital budget dollars. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. So in this portion of the webinar, I'll be covering information that pretty much applies if your appropriation comes through the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. Each agency functions a little differently, especially with paperwork requirements. So you'll need to contact their grants department for more information, of course, depending on which agency you land under. Next slide. So we're going to start off with a little more background information, in particular when it comes to the grants administered by OFCC, as I mentioned. As Jason mentioned earlier, the legislators are the ones responsible for getting your project into the capital bill, which creates an appropriation line item for your project with a specific dollar amount attached to it. And I'd like to note that an appropriation does not mean your project has been approved. It only means that funds have been earmarked for a potential project. Every even year when the capital bill comes out, we get our list of those potential projects to review. And then the folks that we work with at OFCC, we refer to as the project sponsors, are either nonprofits or governmental entities such as a city, township, or village. Next slide, please. The most recent capital bill in 2022 had a total of $191 million in community projects. And I know Jason covered a little bit about these agencies earlier, but along with OFCC, you have the Department of Natural Resources that's funding the parks and rec projects. And then, of course, you have the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, Department of Administrative Services, Mental Health, and others. And your legislator will be the one that worked to determine the best agency that your project would fall under. Next slide. More background information, these are tax-exempt capital bonds, and there are eligible capital expenditures that we have to sort of comb through your budget to look for. The project must support culture over the term of the bonds, which is 10 years, and the project sponsors will complete a submittal form, which we'll review here in a second, and submit that to us, and that will start the review process. Again, every agency is sort of different with how you'll submit information. But with us, it's the submittal form, and sending that to us will trigger the start. Next slide, please. So what exactly is culture? In order to be considered for approval of your grant, the facility must meet the Ohio Revised Code's definition of culture, which you can Google that 123.28, and it pulls up a better description than what I have listed up here. But we work with organizations that provide visual, musical, dramatic, and other art programming. So a lot of your theaters, of course, museums that are presenting principles of science, industry, history, heritage, or art museums. And then we do work with a lot of historical societies. So that would fall under this third bullet here, the presentation and preservation of historical interests in a state or local historical facility. One of the main things that we're looking for with these grants, the cultural grants, is that the facility's predominant purpose should be for culture. Next slide, please. So some of the requirements for the cultural grants include a local match, which is 50% of the total appropriation, or $1 to every 2 state dollars. So for example, if your project receives an appropriation for $100,000, your local match requirement is $50,000. So this can be shown in the form of cash on hand, sometimes in-kind donations, other non-state grants, and sometimes we can use the value of the facility as the match. We also need to see that the project is fully funded before OFCC approval. meaning that all dollars have been raised to complete the project. So let's say you have a budget of $200,000 and your appropriation is only $150,000, then we need to see where that extra $50,000 is coming from before we can move forward. If the project sponsor does not own the building, then we need to see that there is a 10-year lease in place with the building's owner. And then another requirement not listed on here, but we also require proof of both property and liability insurance on the building. Next slide, please. A little more general information on the grant process. So we sometimes require additional information to complete our review, such as additional financial information on the project sponsor, or we sometimes request a schedule for cultural events that are planned at the facility. When OFCC staff is ready to recommend the project for approval, we will draft the cooperative use agreement that will be signed between the project sponsor and OFCC. Once we have the signed agreement returned to us, then OFCC staff will initiate the approval and release of the funds from the state controlling board. And after we have full approval from the controlling board and our executive director, then we can start the reimbursement process. And yes, I know Jason mentioned this earlier, but this is a reimbursement grant. So once the work has started, you'll then send invoices our way for payment, and then the state will directly reimburse the project sponsor via electronic funds transfer. And then the sponsor can in turn reimburse their contractors. Next slide, please. So here's just a general list of items that are eligible for reimbursement under our program. So we can pay for acquisition of property. Of course, we pay for bricks and mortar, the construction. We can pay for some soft costs like your architectural, engineering, and professional fees. Sometimes we can include feasibility studies. We do have a cap on what we want to pay for soft costs, and that's normally around 10% of the budget. Of course, we want a majority of these funds to go towards actual construction. We can also pay for machinery that is part of the structure. So think of like an HVAC system or maybe the installation of an elevator. We can also pay for computer systems, but not software. And we can also fund equipment and furnishings necessary for the function of the facility. Next slide, please. I also want to mention on the reimbursement side, things that we want to stay away from are anything that has to do with the repair of the building. So just going up and replacing shingles that have kind of fallen off, that would be considered a repair. We would need to see a full roof replacement for it to be eligible. We also want to stay away from tuck pointing, which is considered a repair. Any sort of window repair, or if there's cracks in a foundation, just going in and filling that in, that would not be eligible. Just wanted to highlight a couple slides here with our website. It's got a lot of good information on there, and we can share that when the presentation is sent out. But this is our grant project portfolio found under the Our Program tab there. This just kind of highlights some of the projects that we've done in the past. Of course, we're all over the state. You basically just click on any of these little green guys here and it highlights the project. It shows you the grant that they received, the budget for the project, and then the work that was completed there. So it kind of gives you a good idea of the different types of facilities that we fund. Next slide, please. And this is our actual grant portion of the website. Again, more valuable information to clarify a little bit about how our program works. There's a couple good videos that we've created that explain the process as well. But when you actually get an appropriation, this is where you want to land. The bottom there, it shows the funding and grant process. You'll want to click on that. And next slide, please. That takes you to this page here, and at the bottom under grant documents, this is a list of all the documents that we've created for the review and approval process. So there's a grant checklist that you can use internally. We don't need to see that, but it just kind of highlights all the things that you need to have in place before you actually submit to us. And then there's a grant checklist description. The submittal form, which I got the arrow pointing to there, apologize that the print's kind of small on here, but that's the actual document that you will download to your computer and complete and send to us, and that's what triggers the start of the review process. We have a copy of our project approval guidelines on here, which I think is helpful to read before you actually submit as well. And then the template for the cooperative use agreement, which is that legal agreement that I mentioned earlier that we sign with everyone. Template of that is on the website. Of course, we draft that internally when the time comes for recommending for approval. We have a template for the non-disturbance and estoppel agreement, which is the agreement we will sign on top of the cooperative use agreement. And that is for the non-disturbance and estoppel is for when the project sponsor leases their space. So this agreement will be signed with the building owner, the project sponsor, and also the state. And at the very bottom there, we have the Ohio Historic Preservation Office checklist. So a lot of the older facilities that we work with are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or in a district. So if either one of those are the case, then we ask that you complete that checklist and send to the folks at the Preservation Office for their review so they can kind of take a look at everything and make sure you're not in jeopardy of getting delisted off of that National Register. But our projects don't need to go through the entire 106 review form process. I know that's a little lengthy, so we've worked with the historic preservation folks to create this checklist to sort of simplify that process. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to highlight a couple of the projects that we've recently completed. Up in Richland County in Mansfield, we have the Ohio State Reformatory. And the most recent project that we completed with them was $450,000. We installed elevators at the facility and also an ADA compliant walkway outside. Because of these improvements, that facility is now 95% accessible to the public, which is wonderful. Next slide. Also in Mansfield is the Mansfield Art Center. And our first project there was $750,000 for the construction of a wing here. And the top right picture that shows the inside of that wing, and that allowed them to have more classroom space for their art programming. And they were also able to install a glass blowing studio. And just recently this year, we completed the project in the bottom right corner there, which was it was $50,000 was the amount of the grant, and that was to install glass panels in their outdoor pavilion where they have musical and performing events there. Next slide. And finally, also around the Mansfield area in Ashland is the Ashland Theater, formerly known as the Ashland Shines Theater. So these folks were fortunate enough to receive 3 separate appropriations that we kind of combined into one project. The appropriation amount ended up totaling $1.3 million. This project was a complete gut and renovation of this space. We restored the marquee here and also just a picture of the lobby area that was renovated and the cinema space. Next slide. And that pretty much wraps up my portion. Again, my contact information, I apologize I didn't list that on here, but that will be sent with the webinar recording, my email. So if you have any questions that maybe aren't answered in this webinar, or if you just want to take it offline, please email me. I'm happy to help. I'm also happy to schedule a call to sort of talk about your project and walk you through certain things. But please reach out. I'm happy to help. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Jessica and Jason. If anyone has any questions, please type those in now into the chat box. We have a couple already, so we can get started with those. All right, first question. Is the first step of working with your legislator to get the project on a list for consideration?
Definitely. I think that, whenever you're going to be asking for capital budget dollars, those are dictated by the legislature. They're the ones that select the community projects that are ultimately included. And so if you have a specific project in mind that you are looking for those capital dollars for, you need to be picking up the phone, sending that email, cornering them at the county fair, and talking to them about what it is that you're looking for, so that process can get underway.
I'd also like to add that I'd also like to add really quick that I think now would be the time to approach your legislators to request funding if you want to be considered in the next capital budget, which would be like June-ish of 2024.
Kind of following up with both for Jason and Jessica off what Jessica just said, do you guys have any tips for people on how to prepare when they go talk to their legislator?
That's a good question. You definitely want to make sure that that you're very specific with what it is that you're going to be asking for. Don't go in with a vague assumption of how much money, for instance, you're going to be asking. If you know that you need $750,000 to complete the project, you need to go in and say, we need $750,000 in order to complete the project. The more information you have about what that money is going to be spent on, the better. If, you know, some of the examples that Jessica gave there, if you need that new roof, you need that new HVAC system, you're going to want to be able to provide as much information to them as you possibly can. They are going to be very receptive to whatever it is that you're coming to ask for. This is one of the only instances that lawmakers have the opportunity to bring home the bacon to the district. And they're going to want to be as helpful as they possibly can be in moving these projects along through that capital budget process. So don't be afraid to reach out, talk to them. Like Jessica said, now is definitely the time to be doing that. My understanding from the conversations that I have had with folks around the legislature is that they're probably going to be looking to get those requests into the finance chairman by the end of the year. And they're going to begin putting that document together sometime in the mid to late winter, with introduction coming and final passage happening before the legislature breaks for the summer in June. Next year is a weird year because we have the primary happening in March, so there's going to be like basically two brief legislative sessions at the first part and the second part of the first half of the year, but definitely anticipate the capital budget being completed before they break for the summer.
And a couple things that I've kind of learned over the years of doing this. Of course, none of us state agencies have an actual say in who gets anything. It's all up to these legislators. But from the advice that I normally give people, you know, obviously approach them with more than just an idea that you scribbled on a cocktail napkin. I mean, maybe go in with at least some sort of sense from maybe talking from a contractor of how much it's going to cost. And then I would also make sure you request that your appropriation name is just the name of the facility. So in the past, we've kind of run into projects where it says Mansfield Art Center roof replacement. Well, when they add the actual project that you're doing in the appropriation line item, then we are limited to only working on the roof. And it might happen in the meantime where their HVAC system completely breaks down and now that's the main need for that facility and that's what they want to use the funds on. We can't just switch it. It'd have to be a whole legislative change. So that's why I always tell people just to make sure it's known, just to name the appropriation line item, the name of your facility. And then a lot of people also ask me a lot of times, well, how much do I ask for and what's too much? You know, it's all about how much match you're going to have. You know, I think a lot of times people ask for X amount and they might get half of that request. So you might have to, when you come to us, you might have to slim down the actual project a little bit. I think it's also good to let them know that, hey, we've been fundraising for this project, or we will be. They kind of want to know that you've got the capability, I think, to raise funds just in case you don't get your full ask.
Thanks, Jessica and Jason. I think I'm going to cluster a few eligibility questions together so we can kind of do these in a logical flow. So the first question here is, are property and or land acquisitions eligible costs?
Yes, so we can pay for that. It's just that if you're buying a building that's, let's say, vacant and we got to renovate it, then we also need to see the budget as part of the project, that the renovation budget. So we can't just pay for a building that's sitting empty. We have to also pay for that renovation. We basically need to be the last dollar in the project. And when I hand over that last dollar, we need to see that the building is open and operable and providing culture to the public. And I know other agencies are basically the same thing. They want to see a completed project. But yes, it is possible.
Next question is, are federally qualified health centers eligible?
Jason, do you know that one?
I do not actually have the answer to that one. I think we'll have to do a little bit of investigation and follow up with that questioner.
Next question is, can pre-development or design work be a considered eligible cost?
Yes. Again, we've got the cap for our agency, at least, that we can only pay 10% of soft cost of the total budget, but all of those could be considered.
And our next question here is, at a museum, are gallery renovations that include creating new exhibit content fundable projects?
Yes. Again, we've got that soft cost that we have to factor in with the actual creation of the exhibit. We want to focus the dollars more on the actual creating and building of those exhibits and the renovating of the space. We want to avoid, if you are renovating, we can't go in and just slap a new coat of paint on the wall. That would be considered a repair. But if you're putting up new drywall, that's eligible, or doing a complete replaster job, then that would be okay. But again, the repair thing we want to avoid, especially if you have older plaster that you're just going in and fixing, then that would not be eligible. It'd have to be a complete replaster.
And this is sort of related to what you were just mentioning. Robert's question here has to deal with the dividing line between maintenance and a full project. Do you have any guidance on the minimum bar that separates what is maintenance from versus what is a fully fundable project?
So maintenance to me would just be like if you're having issues with your HVAC or plumbing and then you hire a guy to come in and just fix what's already there, that would be a repair and not eligible. We're looking for, if you're having HVAC problems, then we need to see a complete replacement in order for it to be eligible.
And our next question here is, when it comes to equipment and furnishings, is there a particular unit cost or other attributes that would make it eligible or ineligible for reimbursement?
That's a good question. So if we are paying for furniture, fixtures, equipment, then each item that we reimburse needs to be over $100. We also need to see that the useful life of that is going to be more than 5 years. If not, then it needs to be replaced in kind by the organization. But we also, we want to avoid obviously things like plants outside or just items that aren't going to last for a while.
And we have a question here from Karen. Based on the comments from that you've been giving, do I understand correctly that a private university could submit a request for support of a new library or to renovate a former tennis court into a pickleball court?
Jessica might have a bit more information about that, but as far as I am aware, yes, they would indeed be eligible. and those would be acceptable costs.
And I'm not quite sure on that one.
All right, we got a couple more of those, then we're going to switch over to some procedural aspects. So our next couple are, would installation of solar panels be eligible?
Yes.
And security needs and upgrades to security.
Yes. So again, we're avoiding any sort of software related to that, but we could pay for cameras. If you need to install new doors that are more secure, that would be eligible. But yes, we would definitely consider that.
Alrighty. And one final one that's about eligibility here. We know that salaries and benefits are not included, but what about a security company?
That would not be eligible for us under our grant.
I'm not sure that there would be any particular program that would qualify for that.
There might be other, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I was gonna say there might be other opportunities for there's school security grants out there that we've had in the past, but there might be something in the future that comes about for items like that, but mainly for schools.
I missed one in here. Would a community center indoor swimming pool be eligible?
I'm not sure if that would fall under Department of Natural Resources, but that would not be eligible under our program.
All right, we are going to shift a little bit over to more procedural elements of the requests. So you guys just go over very quickly the general process once again for people. Some people were having some questions over the exact flow of what people should be doing.
Jason, you want to go over the front end first?
Sure. Basically, the first thing that you're going to want to do once you know the specific project that you're going to be requesting funding for is to reach out to your state legislature and provide them with as much information as specific as you can be about the project that you are looking to have funded. Once you get their support, they will submit that formal request in to the finance chairman of their respective chamber. The legislative leadership will put together the formal list of projects that will be funded. The budget will be passed and approved within a matter of weeks, signed by the governor, and that becomes effective in 90 days, at which point it gets handed over to the Facilities Construction Commission or the other appropriating agency. And Jessica, take it away for what you all do.
Sure. So that was basically the first hoop of fire that you're jumping through. And then the second would be submitting the documentation to that agency that you've been assigned to, and showing showing documentation for whatever requirements that specific agency has. For us, it's showing that local match is there, that your funds have been raised. So we have a fully funded project that's going to be completed in the end. Other requirements such as property liability insurance, maybe possibly a list of cultural events at the facility, and possibly some other financial documentation, just so we know that the organization is going to be around for another 10 years. And then once we have what we need, then we sign legal agreements, get those funds released from the controlling board. So they're sort of the approvals of our approval, and then they release those funds to us. Then those are sort of saved in our pocket for when that construction does start. And when it does, then you'll start sending me invoices for work that's been completed, and then we'll start that reimbursement process.
Thanks, Jason and Jessica. Next question here is, what is the total capital budget for the biennium? I know this varies year to year. And the secondary question to go with this, is there a minimum and maximum amount of the ask for people?
So yeah. I don't know the total amount, but the max and minimum from what we've seen come through our agency, I think the minimum's been about $5,000 and our max would be 30 million, but that was for a sports facility and that's rare that we get those. So I would say an average max would be 5 million, maybe 1 to 5 million.
And the most recent capital budget, which was approved in 2022, had a total appropriation of just over $3.1 billion.
Our next question here, Jessica mentioned a 50-50 split for the grants, where the receiver of the fund supplies 50% of the budget, whether that be in kind, etc. Is that always the ratio? Because I've been told it's 80-20. So clarification, Jessica.
So it's we wouldn't call it necessarily, well, I guess it would be 50-50. So it's $1 to every 2 state dollars. That is for our organization only. I think others might have a different ratio. I'm not quite sure. But again, ours is $1 to every 2 state dollars. So technically half of your appropriation we would need to see in match.
And I'm getting into some more procedural stuff here. Is there a period of time after which a facility receives an allocation that they will not be eligible for additional allocations in the future?
So I don't believe so with any agency. I know there's through cultural facilities, or I'm sorry, Facilities Construction Commission. We have some projects that receive funding every 2 years. But there's definitely a lot of projects that we've seen, you know, come back for more funding.
I'm not aware of any legally mandated preventions that would keep you from going back each year to request additional funding.
Our next question here is, if dollars are allocated for a project, but things change during the approval process, can the dollars be allocated to a project in the same building or location?
Yes, that's a good question. And that's, again, to my point where you want to keep that appropriation line item total or title as sort of generic as possible and just call it the facility name. Because if there is a change in the project, then we are able to do that before we actually approve all the legal agreements and so on and so forth. So yes, I'm sorry, just to add to that too, we do have a lot of folks that what they actually ask for with the legislators is not really sometimes the project that we actually approve. So there is an opportunity if, you know, a new issue arises with the building that we can focus on that instead.
Thanks, Jessica.
Sure.
Tim has a question here about typically what is the maximum percentage of the total project budget can come from state funds? Is there a restriction on that?
Not that I'm aware of.
And
I'm aware of nothing either.
And can capital appropriations be used to pay down previously incurred debt on a public project?
Again, not with us at least. I don't think any other agency does that, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, it does have to be for new projects. It couldn't be to cover past expenses.
Quick scroll through here, just seeing if there's any more procedural questions. Can you clarify the requirement that all money has to be raised for the project we are applying for? If our capital campaign is for $10 million and has several components, but the portion of the project we are applying for is $5 million, do we need to have funding in place for the $5 million or the $10 million?
That's kind of tricky to answer. I mean, we could always do separate phases for the project. So if the first phase is a $5 million project, you get a $5 million appropriation. then we wouldn't necessarily need to see any additional funds raised. But at the end of that specific phase, again, we need to make sure that that portion is open to the public and providing culture. If not, and the $10 million is what opens the entire facility, then we need to be a part of the whole 10 million.
All right. Since this is a reimbursement grant, what have the presenters seen for a smaller grassroots organization without liquidity in the full amount of the capital project due to the front funds being beyond the match? Are funded projects essentially using capital appropriations to anchor bridge loans?
That's a good question to email to me. I can't answer that right now, but I can find all that information for you.
And Jess, we'll have Jessica's information for you when we send out the email tomorrow, so you can email her directly on that. All right, we've got a couple more questions here just about eligibility costs. Let's see here. Would security entrance items be eligible? For instance, installation of keypads that could be programmed for individual building users.
Yes, we've approved items like that in the past.
And sort of related, back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, is capital costs bearing fully raised before funding? Is that a new requirement for this?
You said for the full funding?
Yes.
No, that's always been in place with us. And I'm sure every other agency as well.
All right, this one's kind of a more of a project management kind of question. Are there any issues with having the phased development approach? We are looking to begin construction based on the cash we have in hand. We want to apply for capital dollars to get us to the completion.
Again, we have to be the last dollar in a project where you're showing me that the doors are open to the public. So, you know, we don't want to be part of phase one that's just, we're renovating a theater, but phase one is just getting like the ticket booth up and running, and there's not actually any movies showing because the rest of the building still needs renovated. So we want to avoid things like that.
All right, and let's see here. If a historical society and a community development corporation co-invest in the acquisition and renovation of a building, is that project eligible?
Yes, definitely.
All right, our next question here is, let me see, let's condense it a little bit. Have municipal governments or quasi-municipal governments like park districts eligible?
Yes, yes, those would fall under the Department of Natural Resources.
All right, answer about, ask two more of these questions and then we're going to wrap up. I will forward both Jason and Jessica all the question sets, so if they feel like they can answer anything that we haven't answered, and you can also contact them directly with those. Our next question here is, can the presenters also speak more about eligibility for cultural and other institutions who are long-term leasees? I know these funds are primarily for organizations that own their own properties, but I heard that there are options for organizations with long-term agreements and wanted to know what the parameters are for that.
Yes, so we definitely work with a lot of organizations that don't own their building, so completely okay if you have a lease. Again, we just need to see that the lease is 10 years past the completion date of the project that we're funding. It's always smart when you're submitting all the documentation to us to send a copy of that lease right away so we can review it and make sure all the requirements are in place to meet our statutory requirements. But yes, those are definitely eligible projects.
And our final question here, this kind of deals back to the timelines. So the capital budget is getting approved next summer. And how long does it take for people then to kind of get the ball rolling? Let's just use your organization, Jessica, as an example here. Though it depends on every organization. How fast can they get their funds, and how long do they have to utilize all those funds?
So the first part, once you know you're in that bill, it's been signed, you can send your documentation into us to start that review project. We put you on our board, at least get you in place in line there. We can't sign any legal agreements or pay any money out until 90 days after the governor signed that bill. So there is a little bit of a waiting period. And then the appropriations are technically good for 2 years. And of course, your legislator also wants to see that those monies have been approved and used in that time frame as well. We do have some that don't necessarily make that 2-year deadline, and those are reappropriated with the new appropriations. We just can't guarantee that that's actually going to happen. Historically, yes, it has, but it's never 100% for sure if they're going to be reappropriated. So I always tell people just shoot for that 2-year time period.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and add, it's not uncommon. They usually, whenever they're doing the capital budget, there's usually 2 that are approved. There's the capital budget, which has the new appropriations, and there's the reappropriations budget for projects that may have been delayed. Weather happens, things aren't able to get done on the timeline that we like to see them get completed on. So those will happen, but as Jessica noted, you have to make sure they're at least being able to show some signs of progress, that there's justification for that to be reappropriated for another 2 years.
Thanks, Jason. And I just wanted to let everyone know there's a couple questions here about getting the presentation. We'll include the recording to this in the email you'll receive tomorrow. And as I said earlier, our YouTube channel, Heritage Ohio, just search for that. It's the first option that comes up. It will also be posted on there, and Greater Ohio will be getting a copy of this, and they'll be posting on their website as well. So just give us about 24 hours. Usually I get these posted later in the afternoon, early evening to YouTube. So they'll be available by tomorrow afternoon for all of you to review. And also all the contact information. I know a couple of you asked for contact information in the questions. We'll include that in the email follow-up that all of you will receive tomorrow afternoon. As we close this webinar today, I once again would like to thank Jason Warner of Greater Ohio Policy Center and Jessica DeLong of OFCC for being with us this afternoon and sharing their knowledge and insights about the state capital budget process. If you were unable to join us for the entire presentation today, and you would like to look back on this presentation for reference, as I just mentioned, you can go to the Heritage Ohio website and also to the Greater Ohio Policy Center website. Thank you again to our 2 panelists for joining us today, and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.